It was raining again. One of those steady, gray drizzles that seemed to make the whole town smaller. I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped through the courthouse doors. The place still smelled like wet floor polish and nerves. I nodded at the security guard, young, distracted, barely glanced at me. Courtroom 4A was already filling when I entered. Damp jackets, murmured conversations, the occasional cough. I took a seat near the back. I didn't know if they'd pick me for the jury. Didn't care, really. I was just doing what the letter said. Like always. I'd worn my only suit, the one from my retirement. The sleeves were too long now, but I'd rolled one back a bit without thinking. That's when I noticed people looking. The tattoo always does that. An eagle wing wrapped around an anchor, inked on my forearm 40-some years ago. Faded now. Like everything else. That's when the bailiff barked. Remove that insignia or face contempt. He said it like I was wearing a badge I hadn't earned. I looked up, met his eyes. My voice came out quiet, but even. I earned it. The room stilled, just for a second. Then the judge's gavel cracked through the silence. But he didn't scold me. He opened a file. My file. I saw the change in his face before he even read a word aloud. And when he did, the silence came back. Deeper this time. Weightier. I wasn't always this quiet. There was a time I used to run barefoot through fields so wide the wind felt like it might lift you clean off the earth. That was back in Dawson County, Nebraska. My family didn't have much, but we had rows of corn and enough sky to feel small under. I grew up with calloused hands and a father who measured worth in blisters and silence. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about yield, storms, and keeping the fence line straight. My mother had a gentler way. She hummed hymns while she shelled peas and taught me to keep my word like it was weight. When I turned 19, I knew two things. I wasn't made for farm rows, and I didn't want to end up like the old men at the co-op who spent 40 years watching clouds. I wasn't afraid of work. I just wanted something else. Something that would make my hands mean more than calluses. The Navy seemed like an answer. The recruiter had a small office behind the post office. I remember he wore his blues like they still fit him and said with a grin, "Son, you'll see more water in a week than Nebraska sees in a year." I shook his hand and signed the papers. That summer, I left home with a duffel bag and a promise I didn't fully understand. Boot camp made men out of mouths and silence out of pride. I learned to shine boots, scrub decks, and follow orders. More than that, I learned to listen. The Navy taught me that real leadership didn't come from shouting. It came from knowing when to act without being told. They assigned me to the USS Kansas. She wasn't a glamorous ship, more steel than soul, but she carried us steady through the world's tension points. The Persian Gulf back then was like holding your breath inside a pressure cooker. You could feel the unease long before you saw it. We patrolled narrow waters where mines drifted like forgotten ghosts and oil tankers burned in the distance. I worked below deck mostly, mechanical crew and sometimes medical assistant when needed. You don't choose the roles that find you in service. You fill the holes and hope you make it home. In '83, one of our sister ships, the USS Calvin, took a hit. We were less than a mile off her port side when the sky went white. I was mid-shift, tightening a bolt on a junction panel, when the alarm screamed, "Fire! Hull breach! Casualties!" Our captain radioed for support. I didn't wait. I grabbed what I could, a breathing mask, bandages, gloves, and crossed over when the seas calmed just enough. The fire was eating through the compartments like it had a hunger. You could hear the metal crying under the heat. I didn't think, just move. The smoke blinded most of us. Sound became everything, moans, muffled cries, the sickening silence of bodies that wouldn't move. I found the first sailor pinned under a beam. He wasn't conscious, but he was breathing. I dragged him out across the slick floor while flames clawed at the ceiling. The second was screaming for someone named Teddy. His leg was gone. I tied it off with a length of torn uniform and promised him Teddy was fine, even though I hadn't seen another soul yet. The third boy had his face burned off. His name tag read Dawson. Like the county I came from. He held my hand until he passed. I didn't let go until I'd carried him to the med boat. I went back. Again and again. I don't remember how many trips I made. I just remember the heat and the weight of men who didn't want to die alone. The fifth one, I carried him last. He was so light I thought I'd broken something just lifting him. He never spoke. Just stared through me, blood trickling from his temple, smoke in his eyes. When I climbed out with him slung over my back, I collapsed. I woke up in the Kansas's sick bay with second-degree burns down my neck and shrapnel buried in my thigh. The medic said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow. Command wrote up the incident. Said I saved 5 lives. Said I acted above and beyond. They gave me a Navy Commendation Medal and a Purple Heart for the burns and the leg. I accepted them, nodded, and folded the papers into a locker I wouldn't open again for 30 years. I never told anyone the details. Not my parents, who just said they were proud and asked if I'd come home for Christmas. Not the men I worked with later in Cedar Springs, who only knew me as Mr. Marks, the janitor who kept the floors clean and never missed a shift. Not even Scout, my dog, who sat with me through more nights than I care to count. Some things get told, others get carried, and I chose to carry. After 30 years in the Navy, I came back to a town that barely noticed. Cedar Springs, Ohio. Population 12,000, give or take. A place with a courthouse, 2 traffic lights, and a diner where they still know your order before you sit down. Some people said it was peaceful. Others said it was where time went to sleep. I just called it home. I bought a modest house on the East End. 1 story, yellow siding, porch swing with rusted chains. It had a leaky roof and a stubborn door that stuck when it rained. I liked it just fine. Me and Scout, my mutt of a dog, made a rhythm out of it. Morning walks, evening porch sits, coffee that tasted better out of a chipped mug. I didn't want much. Never had. After the service, I didn't chase promotions or recognition. I found work where I could, janitorial at the middle school to start. They needed someone reliable. I was that. I scrubbed gum from desks, swept hallways after snowstorms, unclogged sinks when 7th graders got too bold with paper towels. Some of the kids called me Mr. Marks, others just nodded. I didn't mind either way. The job gave me just enough money to fix the truck, feed Scout, keep the lights on. I didn't talk much about the Navy. If someone asked, I just said I did my time. People assumed I was a supply clerk or something small. I never corrected them. I liked being nobody. Then came jury duty. The envelope came folded and official. I considered tossing it, but duty's a hard habit to break. Even when your leg reminds you with every cold morning that some parts of you didn't come back whole. I dressed in my best clothes, same suit from my retirement ceremony, and showed up on time. Courtroom 4A had a cold smell. Bleach and old paper. They called us in rows. One by one. Some tried to wiggle out with excuses. Work, kids, allergies. I just sat still, hands folded, waiting for my name. When they finally called it, I stood slow. My left leg caught a little. Like always. Nobody noticed. We were told the case was minor. Some kind of property dispute. Nothing big. But as the questions started, I noticed something. Noticed who was being dismissed. It started with the young black woman in the 3rd row. She'd answered everything clear and polite. Degree in finance. Said she could be fair. They struck her without cause. Then the older Latino man who said he'd served in the Army Reserves. Dismissed. A third. A fourth. Each time, someone who looked just a little different from the rest of the room was quietly nudged aside. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody had to. I'd seen this before. Not in courtrooms, but in briefing rooms. In mess halls. In deployment rosters where names were circled or skipped depending on who was reading them. You learn to spot injustice when you've lived close enough to it that it stains your clothes. By the time they got to me, I could feel the weight of it. Not heavy, just familiar. Like sand in your boots after a long march. The judge asked if I could be impartial. Yes, sir, I said. He glanced at the tattoo on my arm, barely visible under my rolled sleeve. Military? He asked, like he hadn't already guessed. Yes, sir. He didn't comment, just moved on. But the air shifted. They didn't strike me. Maybe I didn't seem like I'd push back. An old white man, quiet, sitting up straight. I looked like the kind of juror nobody questions. What they didn't know is I was questioning everything. I watched the pattern form, one dismissal after another. Faces blurred, but the message was clear. Some voices weren't welcome. And still, I said nothing. Because sometimes, silence is safer. Because sometimes, if you speak too soon, nobody listens. Because sometimes, it's not about shouting in the room, it's about remembering what the room was like after the shouting stopped. That night, I went home to Scout. Made eggs and toast. Ate in silence while the local news ran highlights from a basketball game I didn't care about. I sat on the porch after and stared at the moon. I thought about the 5 men I'd carried out of a fire. And I thought about how many people never get carried out at all. Not from danger, but from the quiet weight of being dismissed. Scout curled at my feet. I looked at my hands, scarred, steady, older than they used to be. I didn't plan to speak the next day either. But someone else did. And that made all the difference. The next morning, Cedar Springs was still soaked. A heavy mist clung to the streets as if the rain hadn't yet decided whether to leave. I parked a block from the courthouse and walked slow. My knee ached more than usual. Cold and old bones never make for easy company. Courtroom 4A looked the same. Same faces. Same bailiff with the stiff shoulders and the bark that outran his authority. Same judge, Tom Walters, perched up high in his seat like he could see through everyone. I didn't know him personally. Never needed to. But his reputation was all over town. Tough. No nonsense. A man who didn't just keep order but demanded it like tribute. He had a way of narrowing his eyes when someone spoke too long, like words themselves were offensive. That day, his black robe looked heavier than it had the morning before. I settled into the same seat near the back. I'd worn the same suit. Didn't have another. I had, without thinking, rolled back the same sleeve again. And there it was, the tattoo. That same faded eagle wing and anchor, the navy ink from a boy who'd seen too much flame. I caught him looking at it. Judge Walters. Just for a moment. His eyes paused on my arm, then moved on, like nothing. But I saw it. So did someone else. A young deputy. I hadn't noticed him the day before, but now he stood near the bench. 20-something. Trim haircut, boots too clean. He glanced at me, looked at the judge, then shifted uneasily, like he knew something he didn't know how to carry. We began the process again. More jurors, more questions, more dismissals that felt like patterns. I sat still, but the deputy didn't. At some point, quietly, without ceremony, he approached the judge's bench and laid down a folder. Not a word. Just placed it, nodded, and stepped back. I watched it happen. The judge opened it out of reflex, mid-proceeding, as a new candidate was answering a question about impartiality. His hands froze. Eyes locked on the first page. He didn't turn it, didn't scan, just stared like he'd seen something he hadn't expected, and didn't quite know how to return to the moment from. He looked at me. This time, he didn't look away. "Mr. Marks," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the murmur of the room. Approached the bench. The courtroom shifted. Chairs creaked. Heads turned. Even the bailiff looked confused. I stood slow. My knee protested again, but I made my way forward without limping. I stopped in front of the bench. The folder was open now. I saw my name. My Navy photo, young face, sharp jaw, eyes too old even then. And beneath it, a paragraph typed in black ink. I didn't recognize the paper, but I knew the words, because I had lived them. The judge didn't speak for a long time. He just stared, then slowly lifted the page. Then, breaking the formality that wrapped his every move, he cleared his throat and read aloud. Petty Officer Henry Marks, USS Kansas, 1983, entered an active fire zone aboard a struck vessel. Rescued 5 injured crewmen from burning compartments. Sustained second-degree burns and shrapnel injuries. Awarded Navy Commendation Medal and Purple Heart. Commended for gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. The room went still. Not the usual courtroom hush. This was different. This was reverence. I heard a breath catch somewhere behind me. A juror. Maybe more than one. The judge looked up. "You didn't tell anyone," he said, not accusing, just surprised. "No, sir," I replied. Didn't seem relevant. He nodded slowly. The bailiff shifted behind me, uncomfortable. His words from the day before now hung in the air. Remove that insignia or face contempt. I could feel the weight of them return. But the judge didn't look at him. He looked at me. And he said, "Mr. Marks, you may keep your sleeve rolled however you wish." A beat. Then, more quietly, "You earned it." No applause. No music. Just silence. A deep, collective silence. One that held more respect than any medal ceremony I'd ever seen. I turned and walked back to my seat. As I passed, a woman on the jury panel, middle-aged, glasses fogged, nodded and wiped the corner of her eye. The defense attorney didn't look at me directly, but I saw him clench his jaw. The judge resumed proceedings like nothing had happened. But something had. We all felt it. Not just that someone had read the truth, but that someone had dared to leave it where others could see. I didn't know who the deputy was. Didn't know how he'd found my file. But I knew the look in his eyes when he watched the judge read those words. It wasn't pride. It was understanding. He had seen something being dismissed, and he couldn't let it go unseen. There's a kind of justice that doesn't come from verdicts. It comes from remembering. And that morning, in courtroom 4A, a man who never asked for anything got exactly what he didn't know he needed. He got seen. The rest of the day moved forward, but not in the same way. Voices stayed quieter. Movements slowed. It was like the room had exhaled all at once and didn't quite know how to inhale again. No one said much to me after I sat back down. They didn't need to. Some things don't ask for commentary. They settle into the air like dust and stay there, visible in the light only if you know how to look. The judge finished jury selection without the usual clipped tone. I noticed how his voice softened when addressing the remaining panelists. There was something in his eyes, like someone who'd just remembered an obligation long forgot. Not to the court, to decency. I kept to myself. Didn't look around too much. Didn't let the moment sink its teeth too deep. I just waited. When they dismissed us for lunch, people filtered out slow. A few jurors passed by me. One man nodded with a tight smile. Another gave me a thumbs up that seemed more like a gesture he'd practiced in movies than something he knew how to do in real life. I walked out into the gray afternoon. The clouds hadn't broken, but the air felt cleaner somehow. I didn't go far. Just down the block to a small bench near the war memorial. Sat there with a cup of coffee I didn't want but held anyway. Warmth in the hand sometimes feels like something close to company. That's when the deputy approached. Same one from earlier. Uniform neat, but not rigid. He moved like a man not sure whether he should interrupt. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I nodded. He sat. Neither of us spoke for a long while. We just watched the traffic glide by. Slow cars, kids on bikes, someone carrying groceries in a brown paper bag that looked ready to tear. Then he said, My father was Navy. Desert Storm. Never talked about it much. I glanced at him. Mine didn't either. He passed 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Only thing he left me was a box with medals and a cassette tape. One of those old handheld recorders. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small photo. Black and white. Man in uniform, grinning without restraint. This was him. Petty officer first class. Said he once pulled a pilot out of a downed bird in Kuwait. I looked at the photo. Nodded. He looks like he didn't take no for an answer. The deputy smiled faintly. He didn't. That's why I joined up. Was gonna go Navy. Ended up local law enforcement instead. Still wanted to serve. Service takes a lot of forms, I said. He nodded. I found your file last night. Was just doing routine background, jury records and such. Your name pinged something on a veteran's archive. When I opened it and read that line, about 1983. I just sat there for a while. I didn't think anyone'd ever read it again, I said. He looked at me, serious now. Well, I did. And I thought, if that were my father, if someone knew what he did, and still told him to roll down his sleeve or sit quiet, I'd want them to know. I didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. He knew. When I walked back into the courtroom that afternoon, I felt it before I saw it. Respect. Unspoken, but real. The bailiff avoided my eyes. The defense attorney stood when I entered, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. A young juror, maybe no more than 21, held the door open for me without saying a word. Judge Walters resumed the day's business. He didn't mention what happened, didn't reference the file or the words he read. But once, when he called a recess, he looked at me directly and gave a slight nod. It was enough. By the end of the day, the case had begun in earnest. Testimony, objections, legal motions and schedules. It all moved like machinery again, precise and impersonal. But something had changed, not just in the room, in the people. I heard it in the way they spoke, calmer, more considered. I saw it in how the jurors looked at each other, like they finally understood the weight of being fair wasn't just a formality, it was a responsibility. I felt it in myself too. For years, I'd buried the fire behind walls of habit and quiet. But that day, something opened. Not like a wound, more like a window. Just enough light to remember that being seen wasn't weakness. It was relief. At the end of proceedings, as we were dismissed, a young woman, in turn, maybe, approached me outside the courtroom. I hope you don't mind, she said, holding up her phone. But I think people should know about you. I paused, then said quietly, as long as they know about the others too. Others? The ones who didn't come back. Or the ones who came back with more scars than stories. She nodded. And with that, I turned and walked down the hallway. The echo of my steps wasn't lonely this time. It was recognition. That night, the sky in Cedar Springs finally cleared. The rain moved east and left the streets slick with reflection. Street lamps glowed in puddles like pools of firelight, and the town seemed quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. I sat on my porch with Scout curled beside me, his fur still damp from our walk. I held the newspaper in one hand, mug in the other. There it was. Front page. Above the fold. Jury duty hero. Vet's record silenced courtroom. They printed it big. Bigger than I expected. The photo underneath was grainy, a still frame someone had taken as I approached the bench. You couldn't see much of my face. Just the curve of my arm, the line of the tattoo, the folder open on the desk. That was enough. The article told the whole story, or at least their version of how a quiet veteran was asked to cover up a military tattoo. How a judge paused courtroom business to read aloud a record long buried. How something shifted in that room. They quoted the judge, the deputy, even the young intern who said, it was like time stopped for a moment. Like we all remembered something important. I didn't know how they found the rest, about the USS Kansas, the rescue, the medals. Maybe the deputy gave them my file. Maybe someone called the VA. It didn't matter. People finally knew, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Scout nudged my hand with his nose, sensing the tension. I scratched behind his ears. Looks like we're in the paper, boy, I murmured. The next morning, something strange happened. I woke to the sound of tires on gravel. I stepped outside and found 4 people standing near the edge of my lawn. Veterans, by the look of them. 2 wore ball caps embroidered with branch insignia. 1 carried a cane. The 4th, a woman in her 60s, wore her dress blues. They stood silently, then one stepped forward and placed a pair of dog tags on my fence post. For the ones who never got thanked, he said, and they left. By afternoon, 5 more had come. By nightfall, there were nearly 2 dozen. Neighbors began stopping by. Folks I'd seen for years but never really spoken to. Some brought flowers. Some brought stories. One woman placed an old photo album on my porch. Inside was a picture of her brother, lost in Iraq. She said he'd always wanted to be a Navy man. I just wanted someone to remember him, she said. I do, I told her. A few days later, the local American Legion held a small vigil outside Cedar Springs Hall. They lit candles, laid down more dog tags. A few stood up and shared memories. Not just about me, but about themselves. things they hadn't told even their families. One man said he'd been ashamed of how quiet he became after his deployment, how people took his silence as distance, but that watching what happened in Courtroom 4A made him feel seen. "I didn't know a tattoo could do that," he said. "Could make someone stop long enough to remember." They asked me to speak. I declined, not because I had nothing to say, but because sometimes, silence does the job better. Instead, I stood in the back, held Scout's leash, nodded when people looked my way. By the end of the week, I was receiving letters from other towns, other states, from veterans who had sat through courtrooms and classrooms and hospital lobbies with medals in their pockets and no one to tell them they matter. One letter was from a man in Wyoming who said, "Your story made me tell my grandson who I really was." Another from a woman in Georgia, "I kept my uniform in the attic for 30 years. Tonight I took it down." They weren't thanking me. They were thanking the moment, and the truth that somehow slipped into the room and asked to be heard. Word spread. The Navy Alumni Network picked it up next. Someone must have submitted the article. It landed on their bulletin and forums. They reached out to me for an interview. I declined that too, but asked them instead to tell the stories of others, those whose names never made it to any file. A month later, they launched a campaign. Tell one story. The idea was simple. Every veteran should tell just one true story to someone younger. Just one. And it worked. At first a trickle, then a wave. Veterans who'd gone decades without speaking now sat with grandchildren, students, neighbors. Not to boast, but to share, to remember, to connect. Cedar Springs became something of a footnote to it all. The town that paused. The courtroom that listened. The vet who didn't ask but was heard anyway. And my porch? It stayed the same. Quiet. Scout still barked at squirrels. The mail still arrived late. But sometimes, a car would pull up, and someone would place a token by the fence, tags, a patch, a ribbon folded into a glass jar. They never stayed long, just nodded, sometimes whispered, "Thank you," and drove away. They weren't thanking me. Not really. They were thanking the silence that finally broke, and the dignity that filled the space it left behind. I never asked to be noticed. I wore my service like a second skin, scarred, faded, and mine alone. For years, I thought silence was loyalty, that remembering was a private thing. But that day in Courtroom 4A showed me something I'd forgot. Dignity isn't demanded. It's recognized. Not with fanfare, but with truth. One man reading a file. One room going quiet. One town choosing to see what had always been there. I wasn't the only one. There are others, men and women still sitting in the back rows of courtrooms and churches, wearing their stories on skin the world no longer stops to read. Let them be seen. Let one word be enough. Let the silence finally mean something.